For a long time, people were willing to believe this was all random, that events unfolded the way they did because of urgency, concern, or unfortunate timing. One thing led to another. Paperwork moved quickly, decisions were made behind closed doors, and suddenly lives were altered. At first glance, it looked chaotic. Tragic maybe, but still chaotic. Then patterns started to emerge. Not dramatic ones at first. Small details, offhand comments, familiar names appearing in unexpected places, statements that didn't quite line up with timelines, connections that, on their own, could easily be brushed aside. Anyone can explain away one coincidence. Two coincidences still feel uncomfortable but manageable. But when the same names, organizations, and relationships keep resurfacing around the same individuals, the randomness begins to fade. That's where this story really begins, not with a single event, but with repetition. After the removals, people were desperate for information. They wanted to know where everyone had gone, how they were doing, whether they were safe, whether they were together. Into that vacuum stepped reassurance. Claims that everything was better now, that care was being provided, that professionals were involved, that this was all for the best. What stood out wasn't just what was said, but how quickly some people seemed to know details others didn't. Not generalities, specifics. The kind of specifics that usually take time to confirm. Housing models, program names, how care would look, who could visit, who couldn't. Even language that mirrored official systems, spoken casually as if it were second nature. That familiarity raised questions. Some of those questions centered on proximity. Who had access to decision makers? Who had long-standing relationships with agencies meant to be neutral? Who understood the system well enough to predict outcomes almost immediately after actions were taken? That's when attention turned to family ties, not within the family affected, but outside of it. People started revisiting old clips, old conversations, older live streams that had once seemed harmless or irrelevant. In those recordings, references appeared again and again to professional experience with state systems, with adult services, with placement programs. Comments that once sounded like casual background suddenly felt more like context. One connection alone wouldn't mean much. Plenty of people have relatives who work in caregiving or social services. But what made this different was involvement. Advice offered in real time. Guidance on what language to use. Suggestions about what steps should be taken and how quickly. Not from a distance, but embedded in the unfolding situation. Then there were the organizations themselves. Certain names kept appearing. Programs described as safe, structured, compassionate. Places framed as solutions before anyone else even knew a problem existed. These weren't mentioned hypothetically. They were named confidently, as if already selected, as if the path had already been drawn. That raised another uncomfortable question. Were outcomes being discussed before processes were completed? Publicly, it was said no one knew where placements would be, that decisions were out of certain hands, that everything depended on assessments. And yet, privately or semi-publicly, there was language suggesting otherwise, language that implied expectation rather than uncertainty. As more time passed, additional figures entered the picture. Advocates, volunteers, supporters, people presenting themselves as helpers, intermediaries, protectors. Some had backgrounds that aligned closely with the same systems now involved. Others had personal relationships with those who had been pushing for intervention from the start. Again, none of this alone proves intent, but together, it forms a web that's difficult to ignore. The moment that truly shifted perception for many came when someone was seen in public, alive, functioning, moving freely, after weeks of silence. That sighting raised hope, but also raised more questions. Who was with them? Why that person? How do they know each other? And why did that individual, too, have ties to the same organization already mentioned repeatedly? When that connection was confirmed publicly, the reaction wasn't relief. It was confusion, then concern, because now the same organization had surfaced in multiple independent ways, through family background, through public statements, through advocacy figures, and through direct involvement. That's no longer coincidence. That's convergence. What made this especially troubling was timing. These connections weren't discovered years later. They existed before, during, and immediately after the removals. That suggests foreknowledge, or at least preparedness. And preparedness, in situations involving vulnerable individuals, must be examined carefully. Another layer added complexity: power of attorney discussions. Legal authority conversations happening while people were still processing separation. Moves that typically come after long evaluation suddenly being floated early. That alone doesn't imply wrongdoing, but combined with professional familiarity and repeated organizational overlap, it does raise ethical questions. Who benefits from these arrangements? Who stands to gain control, authority, or influence? And who loses their voice in the process? It's important to say this clearly. Questioning systems is not attacking care. Questioning influence is not rejecting help. And asking how decisions were shaped is not the same as denying that support might be needed. The issue isn't whether care matters. It's whether consent, transparency, and independence were preserved. When systems that are supposed to be impartial become intertwined with personal relationships, trust erodes, especially when those affected have limited ability to advocate for themselves. That's why this case resonates so strongly. Not because it's unique, but because it reflects a larger fear many people share, that decisions about vulnerable lives can be steered quietly, legally, and irreversibly, while appearing benevolent on the surface. At this stage, no conclusions are being handed down, but questions must be asked, patterns must be acknowledged, and the idea that all of this is random no longer holds up under scrutiny. And if it isn't, then accountability matters, not just for this case, but for every situation where power, care, and vulnerability intersect. This is only the beginning of untangling those connections. There's much more to examine, and every detail matters. What do you think? Coincidence or something more? Share your thoughts in the comments. As people began to look more closely, the story stopped feeling like a single chain of events and started to feel like a framework that had already been assembled, not built hastily in response to concern, but standing quietly in the background, ready to be used. That realization didn't come from one revelation. It came from accumulation. What unsettled many was how quickly certainty replaced uncertainty. Normally, when authorities step in, there is confusion. Even professionals hesitate to predict outcomes because so much depends on evaluations, timelines, and legal thresholds. Yet here, confidence appeared almost immediately. Statements about where people would end up, what kind of care they would receive, how their lives would look going forward, all delivered with an ease that suggested familiarity, not speculation. That familiarity didn't come from empathy alone. It came from experience. And experience changes everything. People who know systems from the inside don't talk the same way outsiders do. They don't say maybe as often. They don't frame things as possibilities. They speak in structures, in procedures, in models. They reference programs the way others reference neighborhoods. Casually, assuredly, as if those pathways are predictable because, to them, they are. That's when many started to realize this wasn't just concern driving action. It was knowledge. Knowledge of how to trigger responses. Knowledge of what language would escalate urgency. Knowledge of who to contact and when. That knowledge in the wrong hands, or even in well-meaning hands, can shift outcomes long before formal decisions are made. Another layer that raised alarm was how quickly narratives were shaped for the public. Almost instantly, messaging shifted from "something has happened" to "this is for the best." Reassurance was offered before transparency, comfort before clarity. The tone wasn't cautious, it was conclusive. And when people asked questions, they weren't met with uncertainty. They were met with dismissal. "You don't need to worry. They're better off now. You don't understand how bad it was." Those statements shut down inquiry rather than invite it. And they carry weight when delivered by people who appear confident, connected, and informed. But confidence doesn't equal correctness. What troubled observers even more was the emotional disconnect. There was little acknowledgement of trauma caused by sudden separation. No pause to recognize the shock of losing familiar environments. Instead, there was an almost clinical framing, reduction of human lives into logistical improvements. Better housing, better supervision, better structure, all potentially true. But improvement doesn't erase harm, and structure doesn't replace consent. Consent became a central concern. When individuals lack the capacity to fully understand or contest decisions, the responsibility of those around them increases exponentially. That responsibility includes restraint. It includes slowing down. It includes safeguarding not just physical well-being, but emotional continuity. Yet here, speed was prioritized. Why the rush? That question lingered heavily, especially when people noticed that the same advocates pushing hardest for intervention were also positioning themselves for ongoing involvement afterward. Support blended into authority. Assistance blurred into control. And concern began to look a lot like management. Management of people. Management of narratives. Management of outcomes. This is where the ethical line becomes thin, because systems designed to protect can also disempower when guided by personal agendas, even subtle ones. And when those agendas align across multiple individuals with shared connections, the system doesn't need to be corrupted. It just needs to be nudged. Another red flag emerged in how dissent was treated. Anyone questioning the process was framed as opposing care itself, as if asking for transparency meant wanting harm. This false binary, either you support intervention or you don't care, shut down meaningful discussion. But accountability doesn't oppose care. It strengthens it. And yet, accountability was the one thing consistently missing. Requests for documentation were ignored. Clarification was brushed aside. Contradictions went unaddressed. Instead, focus shifted to discrediting critics rather than answering them. That tactic is familiar in many cases where systems feel threatened by scrutiny. The more questions surfaced, the tighter the circle seemed to become. People within that circle defended one another instinctively. They repeated the same phrases, echoed the same justifications, used similar language even when speaking independently. That uniformity wasn't organic, it was learned. And learned behavior implies teaching. Somewhere along the way, a shared understanding formed about what story should be told and how it should be told. Once that happens, truth becomes secondary to consistency. That's dangerous, especially when the people affected by those stories cannot correct the record themselves. One of the most unsettling realizations was how easily roles shifted. A helper became a spokesperson. A supporter became an advocate. An advocate became a decision-maker in all but name. And each transition happened without formal oversight. That's how power moves quietly, not with declarations, but with proximity, with access, with familiarity. And once power settles, it's rarely questioned by those who hold it. The public, meanwhile, was encouraged to move on, to accept that the story had ended, that everything was resolved. But resolution without explanation is not resolution. It's erasure. People sensed that. They felt it in the unanswered questions, in the timelines that didn't add up, in the sudden disappearance of voices that once filled the porch. Absence speaks, and silence, when forced, speaks even louder. What makes this case resonate isn't outrage, it's unease. The kind that settles in slowly when intuition recognizes patterns logic hasn't yet fully mapped. At this stage, no one is asking for certainty. They're asking for honesty. Honesty about influence. Honesty about relationships. Honesty about how decisions were shaped. Because if these connections are harmless, transparency would only strengthen trust. And if they're not, silence only deepens suspicion. This isn't about vilifying individuals. It's about examining systems and the people who navigate them fluently. When fluency exists, so it does responsibility. And responsibility demands scrutiny. There are still many layers left to unpack. More timelines to align. More statements to compare. More relationships to examine. What's clear now is that the narrative of randomness no longer holds. Too many threads converge. Too many outcomes align too neatly. Too many questions remain unanswered. And until those questions are addressed openly, this story isn't finished. It's just paused. What patterns are you seeing that others might be missing? Share your thoughts in the comments. As time passed, the focus shifted from what happened to how it happened. Not the official explanations, but the mechanics beneath them. The small decisions that, when stacked together, created an outcome that felt inevitable rather than evaluated. One of the most striking elements was how language was used. Certain phrases appeared repeatedly, almost rehearsed. Words like safe, structured, appropriate, and necessary became shields, used not to explain, but to end discussion. Once those words were spoken, conversation stopped. Questions were reframed as hostility. Curiosity was treated as ignorance. That pattern matters because language shapes power. When someone controls the vocabulary, they often control the outcome. If the only acceptable response is agreement, then dissent becomes invisible. And invisibility is one of the most effective tools in any system that doesn't want to be challenged. Another detail that troubled observers was how quickly familiarity replaced formality. Boundaries that normally exist between professionals and private individuals seemed unusually porous. First names were used where titles usually stand. Personal reassurances replaced official documentation. Private messages carried more weight than public records. That kind of closeness can feel comforting on the surface. It creates a sense of care, of personal investment, but also dissolves safeguards. When relationships become personal, accountability often becomes optional. And accountability is exactly what protects vulnerable people. There is also a noticeable shift in how authority was perceived. Decisions weren't framed as coming from institutions, but from people. They decided. She said. He confirmed. Authority became personalized, which made it harder to question without appearing to attack someone's character. That's another subtle tactic. When authority is institutional, it can be challenged. When it's personal, it becomes emotional. People hesitate. They soften their objections. They second-guess themselves. Meanwhile, decisions keep moving forward. What added to the unease was how often outcomes were predicted before processes concluded. Long before evaluations were complete, there was talk of permanence. Long before any review, there were statements about where people belonged. That kind of certainty usually comes from one of two places: evidence so overwhelming it removes doubt, or prior expectation. And the evidence, at least publicly, was never overwhelming. Which leaves expectation. Expectation shaped by experience. Experience shaped by connection. This is where the web becomes visible. When individuals have spent years around systems, whether through work, family, or advocacy, they develop instincts about what those systems will do. They know which buttons matter and which don't. They know how to frame concerns in ways that trigger action. They know what to omit as much as what to include. That knowledge isn't inherently wrong. In many cases, it's what helps people navigate bureaucracy effectively. But when applied to other people's lives, especially people with limited agency, it becomes power. And power demands restraint. Yet restraint seemed absent. Instead, there was momentum. Once things started moving, they didn't slow down. Each step justified the next. Initial concern justified intervention. Intervention justified separation. Separation justified long-term placement. Long-term placement justified exclusion from decision-making. By the time anyone asked whether the first step was appropriate, the last step had already been taken. This cascading effect is common in institutional settings, but it's usually checked by oversight. Multiple independent reviews, clear documentation, opportunities for appeal. Here, those safeguards felt distant, if not entirely missing. Another troubling aspect was how selectively information flowed. Certain updates were shared enthusiastically, especially those that reinforced the idea that everything was working. Others, questions about contact, consent, emotional well-being, were met with silence. Not denial, silence. Silence is powerful because it forces people to fill the gaps themselves. And when they do, they're often accused of speculating. But speculation thrives where transparency doesn't. What also stood out was the emotional tone of those defending the process. There was anger, not empathy. Defensiveness, not reassurance. Rather than explaining why concerns were unfounded, defenders attacked the motives of those raising them. That reaction suggests insecurity. People confident in their actions rarely fear scrutiny. They welcome it because it confirms their integrity. Resistance to scrutiny often signals that something doesn't hold up under closer examination. At the heart of this unease is a simple truth. Care without consent is still control, even when intentions are good, even when outcomes appear improved. Human dignity doesn't come from cleaner rooms or scheduled meals alone. It comes from continuity, from choice, from being seen. Drift doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks quiet, withdrawn, compliant, which is why it's often mistaken for improvement. But compliance is not well-being. Another layer that continues to bother many is how future narratives are being shaped. There's already talk of before and after, of rescue and rehabilitation. Those narratives leave no room for complexity, no space for harm alongside help. They also preempt accountability, because once a story becomes a success narrative, questioning it feels like sabotage. Yet real care can withstand questions. Real care invites them. The longer this case sits unresolved in the public consciousness, the more it reveals about how easily systems can be influenced by proximity rather than principle, by who knows whom rather than what is right. This isn't about proving malice. It's about recognizing imbalance. When too much influence flows in one direction, the people at the center lose their voice. And once that happens, even well-intentioned actions can become violations. There are still missing pieces, still unanswered questions, still inconsistencies that deserve explanation. not dismissal. What's becoming clearer, though, is that this story isn't about a single decision. It's about a network of decisions made easier by familiarity, accelerated by confidence, and protected by silence. And silence, especially when it follows upheaval, is rarely accidental. If this process was truly transparent, it wouldn't fear daylight. If it was truly ethical, it wouldn't resist review. Until those conditions are met, the discomfort will remain, and so will the questions. What stands out most to you as this story continues to unfold? Share your thoughts below. As the weeks stretched on, something else became increasingly difficult to ignore. How normal the situation was being made to feel. Not resolved, normalized. The tone shifted from concern to acceptance, from urgency to routine. And that shift happened far too quickly for what was, by any reasonable measure, a life-altering rupture. This is often how uncomfortable outcomes settle in. Not through clarity, but through repetition. When people hear the same assurances over and over, this is best, this is standard, this is how it works, those statements slowly replace the original shock. What once felt alarming begins to feel inevitable. And inevitability is one of the most powerful tools in shaping public perception. Another pattern emerged in how responsibility was diffused. No single person appeared to be in charge, yet many people were influential. Decisions were framed as collective, but accountability remained individual only when convenient. If something went well, it was proof the system worked. If something felt wrong, responsibility became vague. That ambiguity protects systems, not people. One of the most troubling aspects was how emotional bonds were reframed after the fact. Relationships that had existed for decades were suddenly described as insufficient. Familiar routines were labeled harmful. Long-standing connections were treated as obstacles to progress rather than sources of stability. That kind of reframing is dangerous because it erases history. History matters. It provides context. It shows patterns of care that don't always fit institutional checklists, but still sustain people emotionally. When history is dismissed, people become interchangeable units, easier to relocate, easier to manage, easier to justify decisions about. And justification seemed constant. Every concern was met with an explanation. Every explanation pointed forward, never backward. There was little reflection on whether alternatives had been fully explored. Less discussion about whether incremental support could have preserved continuity. Almost no acknowledgement of the emotional cost of sudden separation. Loss was treated as collateral. But for those living inside it, loss isn't theoretical. It's daily. It's waking up in unfamiliar spaces. It's missing voices that once anchored routine. It's the quiet confusion that comes when your world changes without your understanding or consent. That confusion doesn't always show itself loudly. Sometimes it looks like compliance. Sometimes like withdrawal. Sometimes like silence. And silence, again, becomes misread as adjustment. Another issue that keeps resurfacing is how selectively expertise was invoked. Certain voices were elevated as experienced or qualified, while others, especially those closest to the people affected, were dismissed as emotional, biased, or incapable of understanding what was best. Expertise matters, but it is not infallible, especially when it's insulated from lived experience. Those closest to a person often understand nuances no assessment can capture. They notice subtle changes in mood, comfort, and distress. They recognize behaviors not as symptoms, but as communication. When those voices are excluded, the picture becomes incomplete, no matter how professional it looks on paper. What's particularly unsettling is how resistance to this exclusion was framed. Instead of being treated as advocacy, it was cast as obstruction, as if caring too much was itself suspicious. That inversion says a lot. Care should never disqualify someone from being heard. There is also a noticeable imbalance in whose discomfort mattered. Institutional discomfort, risk, liability, uncertainty was treated as urgent. Personal discomfort, fear, loss, confusion was treated as unfortunate but acceptable. That hierarchy reveals priorities. Safety is important, but safety stripped of humanity becomes control. Structure without compassion becomes confinement. Protection without participation becomes dominance. Another thread running through all of this is how future outcomes are being used to justify present harm. The promise of stability later is offered as compensation for disruption now. Once they settle, once routines form, once everyone adjusts. But adjustment doesn't erase trauma. It just teaches people to live with it. And trauma doesn't always look like pain. Sometimes it looks like numbness. That kind of suffering rarely appears in reports. It also doesn't trend online, which makes it easier to ignore. What complicates this further is the public narrative being built alongside the private reality. Stories of improvement are shared widely. Images of order and cleanliness are emphasized. Any mention of distress is minimized or framed as temporary. Narratives are powerful. Once they solidify, they resist contradiction, and anyone who challenges them risks being labeled negative, disruptive, or cruel, especially if the narrative has already been framed as benevolent. But benevolence doesn't exempt actions from scrutiny. The more this situation unfolds, the clearer it becomes that the issue isn't one decision or even one system. It's the convergence of influence, confidence, and silence. A space where questioning feels unwelcome and outcomes feel predetermined. That space is where harm often hides, not because people intend it, but because they stop looking for it. True care requires humility, the willingness to ask, what if we're wrong? The courage to pause momentum, the openness to revise decisions in light of new understanding. So far, that humility feels absent. Instead, there's reassurance without reflection, progress without consent, closure without resolution. And until those gaps are addressed, the discomfort will persist. Not because people want conflict, but because something essential remains unresolved. What part of this process feels most concerning to you as things continue? Share your thoughts below. By the time everything is framed as finished, it often becomes hardest to speak. Finality has a way of closing doors, not just physically, but socially. Once a situation is labeled resolved, questioning can feel like reopening wounds others are eager to forget. Yet unresolved truths don't disappear just because a narrative moves on. They linger. What remains most unsettling isn't any single action or person, but how quickly complexity was flattened. Human lives were reduced to categories. Relationships were condensed into risk factors. History was summarized, edited, and then set aside. In its place came a cleaner story, one that fit neatly into systems designed for efficiency rather than understanding. Efficiency is not the same as care. Care is slow. It's inconvenient. It requires listening to people who don't speak in polished sentences and honoring bonds that don't make sense on paper. It asks difficult questions instead of offering fast answers. And most importantly, it centers the people affected, not the structure surrounding them. Somewhere along the way, that center shifted. Instead of asking, what preserves dignity, the question became, what is easier to manage? Instead of asking, what maintains continuity, the focus turned to, what reduces liability? Those are institutional questions, not human ones. And when human lives are shaped primarily by institutional logic, something essential is lost. That loss may not show immediately. It could take months, even years, to surface. It appears in subtle ways: withdrawal, confusion, dependence, quiet distress. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't always look dramatic, which makes it easier to dismiss, especially when the outside world is reassured everything is fine. Another truth worth sitting with is that good intentions don't cancel harm. People can believe they're helping and still cause damage. Systems can be designed to protect and still traumatize. None of that requires malice, only certainty. Certainty closes minds, and certainty was abundant here. There was confidence that this was the only viable path. Confidence that alternatives